Alright, delegates, welcome to this next video in the Mon Academy Parley Pro series. Here we're going to talk about the meat of conference, the meat of committees. We're going to talk about resolution debate and the substantive motions you have to know in order to fully carry it out. So let's begin with a bit of review about motions. What are they, and what's a substantive motion specifically? So from 2 videos ago, a motion is anything which changes the flow of debate. So we've seen procedural motions, or we will see procedural motions in a future video, and these are things which challenge the way the procedure of committee is going. So things like Parley Pro rules or motions to end debate. But substantive motions change the flow of debate in terms of the substance of what's being debated. So the 2 main substantive motions, which we'll see here, is moving into hearing a resolution. So again, the resolution being a thing of substance which is being debated, and then once you're debating a resolution, to debate an amendment. And just an important note whenever you're thinking about motions is you have to reserve your right, especially in the case of these 2 things. You don't want to be giving a great speech about why we should be hearing your amendment and then forget to have initially reserved your right to hear the amendment. That happens sometimes, and it's just an unfortunate incident. Now let's talk about the procedure. And this is a typo. This should be moderated caucus. So say you're in moderated caucus, ignore this, and you want to hear a resolution. The thing you say is, obviously after reserving your right, is I motion to hear the resolution on the floor authored by Mongolia, for example. Now, this resolution has to have already been submitted to the chair. And barring the case of General Assembly, which we'll get into a future video, there's something called bucketing there, which is a little more involved. If you fit a couple requirements, then your resolution is heard. You move out of moderated caucus and you get into resolution debate. So those requirements are, first, that someone seconds your motion. Pretty obviously, this is the case for essentially every motion. Second is that it must be germane. Germane essentially means it's properly formatted and it's appropriate, right? So this can't just be a paragraph of text. It has to follow the rules of writing a resolution, the preambulatory clause and the operative clauses, and it has to be germane, so it can't be like a silly, like, you can't have a resolution to imprison Santa Claus, right? It has to be germane and relevant. So once this has been determined, there's one more requirement, which is that 20% of the committee are signatories. Now, what is a signatory exactly? Perhaps one of the biggest misconceptions in Mon is that signatories are people who support your resolution. That is not the case. Signatories are people who simply want to hear the resolution debated. They might even vehemently disagree with it, but if they want to hear it debated, they'll be signatories. So how this works is you might be typing up your resolution on a laptop. So you might just send a piece of paper around asking people to sign and say they're signatories, and then that would be added to the bottom of your resolution. It's just typically courtesy to be signatory to a resolution. There's no reason not to be, because it's not saying that you support it per se. So again, this has to be 20% of your committee. So for example, in something like General Assembly, where there's, I believe, 100 delegates, you need 20 signatories. In smaller committees, like the group of 20, that would probably be 4. So you follow the rules there. And if you have something which has an odd number of delegates, I would round up, just to be safe. So once all of these requirements have been made, have been fulfilled, then the authors of the resolution go up for their opening statement, and it's usually 2 minutes, though technically in sort of the Bible of the rules, which you can find on the Mon website, it says that the time limit is 5 minutes, but in practice, no one really goes that far. The chairs will give 2 minutes to speak. Now, an important thing to note here is that your summation, you'll remember that we had the yields before, right? Where delegates can yield to your closing statement. You can also yield to your closing statement if you have a pretty short opening statement. And what's more, you can actually don't have to reserve the right. So at the end, instead of saying I yield the remainder of my time to the chair, you can simply say I yield the remainder of my time to my summation. All right. So once your opening statement has completed, we move into something called non-debatable technical questions, or you may have heard it called non-substantive questions. Now, what these are factual questions, and it takes a bit of practice to get used to what counts as debatable or non-debatable. But usually you're sticking to definitions, clarification questions, asking if there's a typo, and very yes or no questions. So define this term. How much money does this country have to contribute? Very simple questions. And a good way to think about it is that if you know lawyer terms, it can be a leading question for one thing, but it also can be anything which the author can spin to make an argument. So, for example, if you're asking about what are the benefits of this part of your resolution, that would allow the author to start giving their spiel, right? And that can't happen. These have to be very short questions, really not more than a sentence of an answer. And so these are done in the chair will just pick these one by one. And a cool thing is that you don't have to give your introductions in this case. If you remember when we were talking about introductions, was the one case, except for points, if you count those as speeches, in which you do not have to introduce yourself. Then we get into our speakers list. Usually this is 20 minutes, but this varies drastically depending on the chair's discretion and how much time is left in a particular committee session. And this is probably what you're used to. You introduce yourself, you speak about if you favor or you don't favor the resolution, you can yield time to fellow delegates, and you can obviously make amendments, which we'll get into soon. Then once this is done, the speaker gives their 2-minute closing, 2 minutes plus whatever time might have been reserved to them to their summation. And then you vote on the resolution, and it passes or it fails. And then as soon as that happens, you return to moderate caucus. You return to the home base we've always been talking about. So, finally, let's talk about amendments and the process for getting them heard. Amendments are usually there will usually in the beginning be like this form. It's like a slip which the chair has where you can write your amendment, but often they accept like a piece of paper which you can do it on as well. And you are writing in the format of the resolution whatever you're editing. Often a good practice is people will say change section 1bi to this, right? So you're being as specific as possible about what's being changed. Now there's requirements for the amendments as well. First, once you make your substantive motion here, so you motion to hear the amendment authored by blank. Obviously, the motion has to be seconded. Now, 10% of the committee has to be signatories, and the same rules. So you don't have to support the amendment. You simply want to hear it debated. Again, this also must be germane. And finally, another requirement here is that it can't be contradictory. What that means is your amendment can't fundamentally change the purpose of the resolution. So if you have a resolution which is about saving the trees, you can amend it to make it kill the trees. And kind of in this fashion, another thing which is a requirement by amendments is that they can only change the operative clause. If you know your resolution writing, there's something called the preambulatory clause. And that's kind of where the author lays out their intent. This is like the considering blah, 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 concerned that this, taking note that, that kind of beginning fancy part of the resolution. That's usually where you lay out your intent. So you can't write an amendment to do that, to change that, because you're changing the intent effectively. Finally, once all that's been done, once the chair has recognized it, the amendment author has a choice. Is the amendment friendly or unfriendly? If it's friendly, then The amendment author, oh yeah, this is a typo, sorry. Resolution author can find the amendment friendly or unfriendly. If it's friendly, then the amendment author joins the resolution author at the front of the room as a sponsor. So you actually become one of the resolution authors, and it's obviously added to the body of the resolution. Unfriendly, if even one resolution author finds it unfriendly, then you enter pro-con debate, which is what our final video in this series is going to be about. So, I hope through this video you were able to better understand a resolution debate. See you in the next video.